Now, I want to tell you a story. I love these stories. I'm a big fan of UFO stories. And it's an airline pilot who reportedly saw two, should we say, cigar-shaped UFOs? Right? Now, on the afternoon of April the 23rd, 2007, an experienced airline captain looking out of his cockpit window saw something that would stay for him for the rest of his life. And it did as well. Now, at first, he thought it was sunlight reflecting from a greenhouse. What to you and me sounds mad, right? But it was a perfectly ordinary explanation, apparently. But over the next 15 minutes, that explanation slowly disappeared, because the closer Captain Ray Bowyer got, the stranger the object became. Then he reached for a pair of binoculars, like you do, right? He's seeing something weird. So he's picked up these binoculars to see if he can clarify. Right now, instead of solving the mystery, they made it even bigger. The object wasn't a reflection. It wasn't an aircraft. It was a huge glowing shape suspended over the English Channel. Now, this story is fantastic. Then something happened and turned an unusual sight into one of Britain's most talked about UFO cases. A second object appeared. Now, we are going to investigate this a little bit deeper if you want to stick around. Another commercial pilot later reported seeing the same unusual thing, but we will cover that. Two people walking on a nearby island off Sark also described seeing bright yellow objects in the sky. Suddenly, this wasn't just one man's story anymore. Now, you jump nearly 20 years later, scientists are still trying to debate what happened. Some believe the answers lie in a rare atmospheric phenomenon, and if you want to buy that, then it's fine. Others believe there are simply too many unanswered questions. So, and this is the big question, right? Did Captain Ray Bowyer witness one of the most convincing UFO encounters ever reported by a commercial airline pilot? Or was it one of the most remarkable optical illusions ever seen in Britain's skies? What do you think? Now, on this episode, we're going to examine every piece of evidence, right? Every witness, every scientific explanation, and I will let you decide. Because this isn't just another UFO story. It's a mystery that simply refuses to go away. Now, if you follow my videos, you'll know that I'm a massive UFO fan, and this is UFO, aliens and weird stuff. So, let's carry on, right? Now, Ray Bowyer had no idea he was about to become part of UFO history. To him, it was just another ordinary day's work. He'd flown this route countless times before. The flight from Guernsey to Alderney apparently takes less than half an hour. The weather that afternoon was beautiful, clear blue skies, excellent visibility, very calm conditions. Now, if you were a pilot, you probably describe it as the perfect day to fly. Now, apparently there was only a handful of passengers on board this Aurigny flight GR544. Everything about the journey felt routine. Ray completed all his checks. The aircraft climbed away from Guernsey, and within minutes they were cruising over the English Channel. Lovely, perfect day. Everyone's having a good time. Then something caught his eye. It was just a bright yellow light sitting low on the horizon. Now, to him, it was nothing more. His first thought was completely logical, and being an aircraft pilot, I think that's important. You have to think logically, right? He thought it must be sunlight reflecting from one of the greenhouses in Guernsey. Now, the Channel Islands are famous for them, and on a bright spring afternoon, reflections can be surprisingly intense. And not being a pilot, I didn't realise that was the case. Most people would have forgotten about it and carried on flying, but Ray couldn't. The light wasn't behaving the way he expected. The closer he flew, the less sense it made. So being inquisitive, he reached for his binoculars. Now, later, he admitted he expected them to solve the problem. You know, get your binoculars, look through it, suss what it is, and go, okay, yeah, that's cool. Instead, they completely changed it, apparently. Now, looking through the lenses, Ray realised he wasn't looking at a bright reflection at all. What he was looking at was something with shape, something solid. He said something he had never seen before. This is how he described it. It was long, glowing bright yellow, and across the middle was a dark band. Now, the dark band thing, I think, is important, right? Just bear that in mind. Ray later said it looked as though the light was coming from inside the object itself, like it was translucent. He lowered the binoculars. The object was still there. You know when you go, wait, what? What's that? What's that? He looked again. Still there. He checked his instruments. Everything was normal. The aircraft was flying perfectly. Only one thing had changed. The view from outside the cockpit. Those two weird orange lights. Ray stared through his binoculars for a few more seconds. The object wasn't changing. If anything, it was becoming clearer. As I say, he said it was long, bright yellow. It had smooth, round edges, and that dark band across the middle was still visible. So if you go back years later, Ray would say he'd never seen anything like it in all his years of flying. Now remember, and this is important, right? This wasn't someone with a camera standing in a field. This was an experienced airline captain. But I'd like to go back, right? If you are someone standing in a field with a camera and you do see someone, that in no way does that make your sighting less important. In fact, if you have seen something, drop me a line, tell me your story. I've got an email address, UFO aliens and weird stuff at outlook.com. All right. If you've got any stories, I will tell them for you, because every single sighting is important, right? So anyway, let's go back, right? So this wasn't someone with a camera standing in a field. This was an experienced airline captain, someone who spent thousands of hours looking through cockpit windows. He knew his onions. Someone trained to recognise aircraft, weather reflections, and anything else that might appear in the sky. He is a professional, right? That's one of the reasons this case attracted so much attention. Ray wasn't claiming he knew what the object was. He was simply saying, I don't recognise it. That's it, I don't recognise it. And that's a big difference. Then things got even stranger. As he continued watching the first object, another one appeared, slightly further away, but almost identical. The same bright yellow glow, the same elongated shape, the same dark band running across the middle. Now there were two. For a moment, Ray simply watched them. Now he later estimated that the first object had been visible from around 50 to 55 miles away. Now if his estimate was anywhere close, then whatever he was looking at appeared to be absolutely enormous. In fact, he later suggested it may have looked as much as a mile across. Now, this is important. Before we go any further, it's worth saying something. Now, we know judging the size of anything over open water is incredibly difficult. Judging the size at all is incredibly difficult. Pilots know that. Investigators know that. Even Ray acknowledged it was only an estimate. But one thing is beyond doubt. Whatever he believed he was looking at appeared far larger than any aircraft he'd ever seen. Then something happened that investigators would later find particularly interesting. One of the passengers looked out the window and noticed the strange object. A few moments later, they spotted the second one as well. Now that's important, not because it proves that objects were UFOs, because really it doesn't, but I do think they were UFOs. But it tells us that Ray wasn't the only person looking at that part of the sky. More than one person was seeing something unusual. And don't forget, around the same time, two people walking on the nearby island of Sark would later report seeing two bright yellow objects hanging over the horizon. And then came another report. A pilot flying another aircraft roughly 25 miles to the south also described seeing something unusual. So for me, that cements what he's seeing. Piece by piece, the mystery was growing. Different people, different locations, different angles, all describing something out of the ordinary during the same afternoon, what for me strengthens the case that he did spot UFOs. So let's step there for a second. Imagine you're Ray Bowyer. You're responsible for the safety of everyone on board. You now watching two objects for around 15 minutes. You still don't know what they are. You still don't know what they do. The answer isn't actually very simple, right? So what do? I'll tell you what you do. You report them. And that's exactly what Ray did. He reached for the radio and informed air traffic control that he was looking at an unidentified object ahead of his aircraft. Now notice what he said. He didn't say it was an alien spacecraft. He didn't say it was a secret military aircraft. And he didn't even call it a UFO. He simply reported something he couldn't identify. And that's exactly what a professional pilot is trained to do. Now, back on the ground, air traffic controllers immediately began checking the obvious possibilities. Now, was there another aircraft in the area? Any military activity? A weather balloon, even? Anything that could explain what Ray was seeing? But nothing obvious appeared. Of course, that don't mean the object was extraordinary, but to me it does, right? It simply meant the easy answers weren't presenting themselves, so they can't eliminate it. So they can't say it's a weather balloon because there isn't one. They can't say that it's another aircraft because there isn't one. They can't say it's military because there isn't one. Now, by the time flight GR544 landed safely in Alderney, the object had disappeared from view. So, for the passengers, it had been an unusual flight. Nothing more, nothing less. For Ray Bowyer, it was the beginning of a mystery that will follow him for the rest of his life. Now, within days, newspapers across Britain were reporting the story. Television crews arrived in the Channel Islands. Radio stations wanted interviews. People were all asking the same question. Had an experienced airline captain just witnessed one of Britain's most convincing UFO sightings? And for this UFO nut, I am going to say yes, he did. But there is always explanations waiting to be discovered. That's where the story takes an interesting turn. Because while many people focused on the possibility of a UFO, scientists were quickly looking somewhere else entirely, not into space, but into the atmosphere above the English Channel. And what they discovered is every bit as fascinating as the sighting itself. I don't go for it, I don't buy it, but I'll tell you about it. Now, over the next few days, the story started spreading. At first, it was local news in the Channel Islands. Then newspapers across Britain picked it up, as they do. Before long, people around the world were talking about what had happened over the English Channel. And it wasn't difficult to see why. Like we said before, this wasn't a tourist with a mobile phone, even though I will say again, that doesn't make the tourist with the mobile phone any more important, but this bloke's a pilot. It wasn't someone filming strange lights from their back garden, but if you do, let me know. This was an experienced airline captain, a man whose job depended on recognising what was in front of him, right? Recognising the skies, recognising clouds. That immediately gave the story a level of credibility that many UFO reports simply don't have. But here's something that often gets forgotten. Ray Bowyer never claimed he had seen an alien craft. He never said he had seen little grey men. He never claimed to know what the object was. He simply said, "I don't know what I saw." And that's why the story refuses to go away, because there's a huge difference between saying, "I saw an alien," and saying, "I saw something I couldn't identify." They're not the same thing at all. Now, as more journalists began speaking to Ray, one thing became quickly obvious, and this is really important. His story never changed. The same detail came up again and again and again. Two bright yellow objects, a dark band across the middle, about 15 minutes, a huge apparent size, no sudden movements, no impossible speed, just two strange objects hanging in the distance. And if you're making up a story, that's actually quite unusual. Most stories grow over time. New details appear. The mystery becomes bigger. And Ray's didn't, right? He always stuck to the fact. In fact, if anything, he was careful not to exaggerate. Whenever someone asked him what he'd seen, he gave the same honest answer. I don't know. Now, of course, being a reliable witness doesn't automatically mean you were right. That's important. Even the best pilots can misjudge distance, and of course they can. The atmosphere can create remarkable illusions, apparently. Our brains can sometimes misunderstand what our eyes are seeing. Investigators knew all of that. That's why they never rely on just one witness. They're looking for supporting evidence. And in this case, as we know, there was some. We've already gone through it. As the investigation continued, reports emerged that another commercial pilot had seen something unusual that afternoon. As we said, 2 people on Sark had reported seeing strange yellow objects over the sea, and passengers had noticed them from Ray's aircraft. Then there were reports about radar. Now this is where we need to be careful. Over the years, you've probably heard people say that radar proved that there were 2 UFOs over the English Channel. The truth is, it's not that simple. There were reports of unusual radar returns during the time of the sighting. Some researchers believe that supports Ray's account. Others argue the radar information is far less conclusive than what people often claim. Even today, there's no universal agreement about exactly what the radar was showing, and that's okay, of course it is, because good investigators don't ignore the bits that don't fit. I don't get the radar thing. I don't get the radar thing. There's either a radar or there isn't a radar. I don't know. That confuses me, right? Look, I'm not a specialist, right? But if there is a radar ping, some people are going, there were 2 radars. We did see them. Surely they did see them. How can it be an anomaly? Anyway, look, they acknowledge them. They acknowledge the facts that don't fit, and that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to look at all of it, right? The witnesses, the radar, whatever that is, the science, the skeptics, and the UFO theories. Because if we're going to ask whether this was one of Britain's best UFO cases, we owe it to the story to examine every side fairly, and of course we do, right? That's when investigators turn to the one thing nobody had really been talking about, the weather. Not because there was a storm, because there wasn't one. In fact, the weather was almost perfect. And strangely enough, that may have been exactly the problem. Because under perfect conditions, apparently, the atmosphere is capable of doing something that almost seems impossible. And that is it can bend light. Not by a lot, but just enough to make the impossible look completely real. And you see that, don't you? You know when you see a ship hovering, and it looks like it's hovering, but it's not really. It's got something to do with the curvature of the planet and light and all that sort of stuff, right? To make the and the idea that would come under the most debated and that idea would become one of the most debated parts of the entire Ray Bowyer mystery. All right, was it a bend of light? Because if scientists were right, then nature itself may have created one of the most convincing UFO sightings ever reported. But if they're wrong, then we're left with a very different question. If it wasn't the atmosphere, and it wasn't, that's my opinion, what was Ray Bowyer actually looking at? And I'll tell you what he was looking at. He was looking at 2 cylindrical UFOs. That's what he was looking at. Now, if you're into the UFO subject, look, and I know I am very biased. I know that. I can't help it. I am very biased, right? I don't believe in the scientific stuff they come out with, mate. We've had some tragedies, haven't we? From swamp gas, reflections of clouds. We know that scientists make up stuff, and it wouldn't surprise me if the government paid the scientists to lie either. It just wouldn't. It wouldn't surprise me, right? So, what did Ray Bowyer see then? Was it 2 cigar-shaped UFOs, or are you going to go for light reflection, swamp gas, weather balloons, you know, that sort of thing. So, so what do you think? Now, I appreciate you being honest with me, all right? Because that, you know, that's the whole point of the video, yeah? We talk about UFOs. If you're a skeptic, please drop me a line. I love to chat. It's fantastic. I will never dismiss a skeptic's view. I just don't believe scientists are as unbiased as what they should be sometimes. Right, well, this was UFO Aliens and Weird Stuff. Really appreciate you sticking around. I really appreciate it. And like, subscribe and ding that notification bell if you can. And I will see you on the next one. Thank you.